Hello and welcome to my video, Trusting the Count, a Teacher's Guide. In this video, I'm going to be firstly going through what trusting the count is, what does it actually mean. Then I'm going to be specifically talking about the role of subitizing and the composite unit and how that all kind of works and gels together. And then I'm hopefully going to give you some practical tips, some ideas of how you can make sure that you're covering the idea of trusting the count with any year level, no matter what year level it is. So from prep right through to even year 12, and how trusting the count can fit into that. Alright, so to begin with, let's talk about what trusting the count actually means. And so in teaching mathematics, foundations to the middle years, Di Siemens talks about trusting the count, and she introduces it with this example of yellowness. So thinking about how you actually came to know what yellow is. Because when you close your eyes and you picture it, I'm sure you can have this mental object, this sense of what yellow is. And so that mental object has only been developed and built in your past, your family, your friends, constantly pointing out different things that are yellow and labeling it with the word yellow. And then so you're slowly over time building a hypothesis around, well, what is yellowness? What are the boundaries of it? And how do I know when I see something yellow that it is yellow? So what we want to do is put that same thinking into the digits from 0 to 9. So just like we fully understand the different colours and know where they cross over and where they blend together, we want to have just as strong connection to each of our digits. So now let's think about, well, what does it actually mean to have mental objects of the digits 0 through to 9? And so let's take 6 for example. If I can trust the count and have a mental object for 6, it means that I can bring up, when thinking about the number 6, I can bring up mental imagery of sixness. And more than just, let's say, one learnt pattern of what 6 looks like on a 6-sided dice, I want to be able to 6 in a multiple of ways. So I want to be able to know that it's a 3 and a 3, that it's a 5 and a 1, a 4 and a 2, that it's 4 less than 10. So I need to have so many different experiences seeing the 6 in different contexts to make that mental object really robust. And so that basically, when I need to draw upon my understanding of sixness, I want to bring up a specific mental imagery for 6 that suits my context best. So for example, if you ask me, well, how many 6s in 9? I might have a mental object of 9 as 3 rows of 3, and I can see 6 sitting in that very, very nicely. Or if you ask me to said 8 and what's 6 more, in this case I'm going to picture my 6 as a 4 and a 2, with that 2 going to make 1 10 and 4 left to have 14. So I think one thing I've noticed with teachers in particular is we get really fixated on the friends of 10 and making sure that students have all their friends of 10 down pat. And obviously that's really useful, especially when we're doing addition strategies like building to 10. But then perhaps we're too quick to just move on, when really we need not just the number bonds for 10, but we need to have those sophisticated understandings of the number bonds for all our digits so that we can become really, really flexible. And I guess that's fundamentally what trusting the count's about. It's about having those number bonds for all the numbers and that mental imagery so you can call upon them, call upon the right context for the right time. So now that we've defined what trusting the count is, let's talk about how subitizing fits into that. So when it comes to subitizing, there's actually 2 different types of subitizing. The first one is called perceptual subitizing. Now this is just an innate ability that we have as humans. And we can basically subitize up between 4, 5 with practice, objects at a time. Now they've even tested this on 6-month-old babies, where they put two pictures, one with 2 dots, one with 3 dots above their cot. And then they'll have a little drum and they'll beat the drum 2 times. And as soon as they beat the drum 2 times, the baby's eyes naturally focus in on the image of 2 dots. Then, a moment later, they'll beat the drum 3 times and the baby will switch its attention and recognize start looking at that image with 3 dots. So this is an innate ability that we all have. But then where it changes, let's say once we get beyond 5, is then we have a new thing called conceptual subitizing. Let's now look at an example to see exactly what it means to subitize conceptually. Now you might have already worked out that there's 9 dots, but I can guarantee you that you didn't see 9 individual dots and just recognise it 9 straight away. More than likely, you saw a 2, a 3, and a 4, and then knowing that you've seen a 2, 3, and a 4, you've used your addition strategies to then put those together and combine them to reach the total of 9. And this is exactly what it means to subitize conceptually. So when you're looking at that 3, you're not seeing the 3 individual dots, but rather you're seeing the whole as 1, 3. And when you see that 4 on the side, you're not seeing 4 individual dots, but you're seeing that as 1, 4 itself. So when you, over time, the more experience you have with subitizing, you start to basically see the structure of these collections in different ways and just internalize it and see it almost as one image in its own right. And then you're using your addition strategies to pull it all together. And so that's what it means to subitize conceptually. And so the last key component of subitizing that I'd like to bring your attention to is that, and why it's so important, is that when we're counting, so let's just say counting by ones, the focus is on the individual units along the way. But then perhaps when you're measuring, and let's say I measured my table and it was X long, you're focusing on the whole. But subitizing is completely unique in that you're simultaneously attending to the collection size and the whole. And so that's one of the key understandings that we really want to build up with our students. Now I'd like to just take a quick segue for a moment and consider the alternative. So what happens when we ignore the skills of trusting the count and we don't expose our students to enough subitizing? What the alternative looks like. And quite often that alternative ends up with spending too much time overly counting, focused on, counting by ones. And so if you have a look at this graphic behind me, this graphic serves, you can see there's 2 mountains and this big 3-lane highway going across it. This picture serves as a metaphor for how students basically map their neural networks. And so consider this, the neural pathway that students have created by focusing on counting by ones. So if they have grown up and gone all through their schooling, and now I'm sure some of you, no matter what year level you've got, even perhaps year 9s, you still might have some year 9 students that you ask them a simple addition problem and their first response is to count by ones. And how that's happened is basically they've spent their entire schooling going through, and every time that they get a problem, their first strategy is to count by ones. And so this is strengthening the pathway between the question and the strategy. And so if this is so ingrained, it becomes this giant highway that it's super easy for them just to cruise across. Now, if we then try and interrupt this pathway that they've created, let's say that instead of giving them a question such as, what's 6 plus 5? Instead of going 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, if we want them to suddenly think of it, no, imagine the 6, imagine the 5 with the 5 splitting into 4, making a tens frame, and then that one more to make 11. The first time they try and think in this new way, it's like standing on that freeway, suddenly sidestepping to the edge, and then tossing a single rope across that mountain, and then tightrope walking across. Now, if they do that for a second time and visit that same thinking and visit solving that problem in that same way a second time, then perhaps they throw an extra rope back. Now they might have one rope to hold on their hands and they can shuffle across. Now, the more times we get our students to visualize and use these strategies in a different way, slowly they throw in more ropes over, then after a while they might be able to lay some planks, and over time that pathway will increase and hopefully ends up being its own 3-lane freeway, just like the one that's up there. And that counting by one strategy, if it's not being used, will slowly fade, slowly crumble, slowly break down. But now the big problem is, if that original strategy has been embedded for years and years, as soon as our brains always want to take the course of least resistance. So as soon as they come up to that mountain pass, their natural instinct is just to zip across where the easy way. So it takes a lot of effort to try and get them to move away from that. And that's what we really want to try and get at with our subitizing. We don't want this freeway that's only where their students are locked into counting by ones. And one of the main reasons for that is because if that's your only strategy, it doesn't really apply well when you start using 2-digit numbers, 3-digit numbers, where the visualizing strategy, well, all you're doing is in your mind, you're swapping out the ones for groups of 10 or groups of 100. So ideally, it's way better to get the visualizing strategies, those thinking about structure, thinking about trusting the count, embedded right from the beginning before we make these super strong pathways around counting by ones. But we know we have all got students, no matter what year level they are, that are stuck. So then it's about, well, how can we all take responsibility for this idea of trusting the count? And how can we do our best to expose them to structure, expose them to thinking as visual as possible, so that at least they can start throwing some ropes across, they can start building an alternative bridge. And the hope is then when they get to some more complex examples, they'll realize that actually in this scenario, my counting by one strategy isn't as effective, and I can really start to strengthen this other way of thinking visually. So at this point, I hope you're starting to think and realize just how important this idea of trusting the count is. And I get it, because I was in this position quite a few years ago. And so when I heard this information for the first time, my first thing was like, great, I want to make subitizing a part of my everyday practice. And so naturally I started to go hunting and looking for resources. But unfortunately, when I did, I quickly realized that most of the stuff out there didn't really necessarily align with the research, and included a whole heap of extra distractions and colours and things that were just taking away from trying to build those mental objects in their purest form. So instead of going ahead and making my own sets of subitizing flashcards, cutting, printing, laminating them, I thought, no, that's going to take a while, but also I'm just going to end up losing them and they'll all get mixed up and it'll just be a nightmare. So instead I took on the endeavour of creating a subitizing app, which is now on the App Store. It's called Subitize Flashcards, and it's basically just a set of all different kinds of flashcards that you can use to basically hit any level. And so I'm just going to use some examples from my app to talk to as we talk a bit more about subitizing. So this is the app here. You can see I've got a few categories. I've got 10 frames, random, pattern and place value. Let's start with random. So you can see here I've got some different difficulties. And so I started small as collections of 1 to 5, then build up to 3 to 7, all the way to 10 to 20. So it gets quite tough towards the end. But let's just go into 3 to 7 for now. And so basically it has a collection of cards that it shuffles up each time you're in it, so you're never going to get them in the same order. And if you hit next, the randomized dots will flash up for 2 seconds, or you can adjust the timer in the settings, and then it'll just go white. And I thought this was a really important part of the design, because we want our students to be able to see a collection just like the one that came on there, but then we want them to have time to actually think about it and pull it all together. And then the beauty of it is we can then hit, if we're not sure or we have a prediction about how many there were, we can click the back button to bring that image back up. So in this case, I knew that it was a 6 because I could see the 5 pattern just like it usually appears on a six-sided dice, and then I knew that there was this extra one here. But you might have perhaps seen it differently, and this is a really useful part of this tool. And just if you've got your own cards in general, it doesn't have to be on the app, but you could discuss with your students, well, what did you see? So I saw the 5 with the 1 extra one. Some other students might have seen a 3 here and a 3 here, so perhaps more like the pattern on a 6-sided dice, where this one's been warped into the center a little bit. And having those different discussions around what they see shows us that, well, we all got the number 6, but I saw it as a 5 and a 1. while one of the other students saw it as a 3 and a 3, and then perhaps even another student might have seen a 2, a 2 and a 2. And those are the kind of discussions we want to be having when we're doing our subitizing. So let's just go back again for an example, and let's have a look at the frames. So we can start as simple as 5 frames with all the different combinations up to 5, and then once our students are super strong with that, we can then move it into tens frames. And you'll notice that these particular tens frames have that structure where they slowly just where it moves across. But then if I go back down to here, we've got tens frames, but now they're slightly more random. So you're still having to, partition those numbers potentially 2 or 3 times to then pull the collection together. Now, once students have been able to nail the 5 frame, then the tens frame, when it starts to get interesting is here when we go to the 20 frames. So now I can just work on adding 2 collections together. But if I just keep clicking this back button until I find a 10 up the top, so let me just find one. Oh, there was one. I can pause that top collection. So now the top collection's always going to stay a 10 and the bottom tens frame is going to change. So this is a really quick way to work through and build up visualizing all the teen numbers, because we know the minefield of the teen numbers with the language and just how tricky it is, because we know how much of a sticking point that is for so many of our kids, with the teen numbers just not making sense. But this at least really shows us the structure clearly. But then we can go one step further. So if I unpause that tens frame at the top there, and I just find a number 9 here, I'm going to now pause that as a number 9 at the top. So now at the top, that's going to stay a 9. And so now what we're doing is we're practicing the build to 10 strategy, and we're visualizing whatever the bottom collection is, we're visualizing one coming off that collection to make a 10, and then visualizing what's left over. So we can straight away see here that 9 and 1 is 10. But if we go to the next example, so there we saw the 9 at the top and the 7. So in my mind, I was visualizing either this one just sneaking up there to make 10, and then I know that I've got a 4 and a 2, so 6 left, or potentially I could have visualized this one here going up, and then I've got a row of 5 and 1 more to make 6. So you can see that this is a really great visual representation of that build to 10, where you're using those ideas of trusting the count to simultaneously attend to both those collections at the same time. Whereas without supporting that visually, if I was just to explain that, then I would have to say, all right, we'll start with a 9, you've got a 7, subtract 1 from 7, then add the 1 to the 9, and then you'll have 10, and then go 10, add 6. Now that's just a lot of steps when you think about breaking it down like that. But visually being able to see it, we can manage all that almost as one fluid movement, and that's what we want to get to with our kids. And if we practice that enough, the idea is that then they'll be able to do that without actually needing the visual there to support them. They'll just be able to bring up those mental objects in their mind and do those calculations for themselves. Then once you've focused on those strategies individually, then you can just take the pause function away and just keep testing randomized ones, and they can just look for whatever strategy suits the time at hand. So obviously that time we had an 8 and a 2, so that's one of our tens facts. There we've got one of our teen numbers, so 18. Here we've just got 5 and 1 more makes 6. And here we've got a bit of a build to 10 situation. So if I go back to that, so we've got the 4 at the top, imagining simultaneously that 3 going in to make 10, having 1 left, making 11. So that's how we can use the Subitising app, not just to instantly recognise collections, but to also work on our addition strategies. So one of my favourite card sets on here is the 2 dominoes here. So basically it shows up 2 dominoes, and when we think about our conceptual Subitising, if I just go back onto this one, you can see here that we're basically required to subitize 4 individual things. So I can see 2 2s, 1 3, and 1 5. And then, after I recognise those collections, I'm then free to try and work them out and put them together. Now, one thing I would like to mention about subitizing is that even though it comes from the Latin word subitus, which means suddenly, so even though it's about suddenly, instantly recognising what those sets are, I wouldn't necessarily focus and put all my attention on focusing on speed to pull that all together. Once you've got that quick recognition of the sets, it's okay to have some think time to then try and use your strategies to pull those together. I would much rather my students focus on that visualization and spend the time imagining those collections and how they might structure together to find the total than I would about them just trying to be as fast as they can. Because if they're just focused on speed, then often they'll just have a rough guess and they won't really be building these visual pathways that we want them to. So the last thing I'll talk about now is I also have this place value section where it structures 2-digit numbers with either straws or counters. So for example here, now we're showing a count of 10s and a count of 1s. So now really quickly we can start subitizing it all the way up to 109. So now all of a sudden we're able to subitize all the way up to 109 just by looking at these collections. Now I also built some extra functionality here where if we click the back button, we can also add 10, take 10, add 1, take 1. So we can really tease out some of those struggle spots students have, in particular when they're counting back by ones. So for example here we've got 62, 61. When it goes to 60, they'll often skip down and they'll skip that decade and skip down to 59. But you can see here by clicking back, it really shows that visually as it moves along. So now this is probably the perfect moment to stop there and now talk about how the skills that we can develop with students through subitizing can then be extended to ideas surrounding place value. So for anyone that has anything to do with teaching place value, this article above called The Acquisition of Number is an absolute must read. It really nicely breaks apart the different concepts and the way students think about place value as they develop their understanding. And it breaks it down into these 4 key stages. Now, if you want to find this article, just search The Acquisition of Numeracy on Google and it'll come up. It's free, it'll just be a PDF. So if you're going to take away anything and want to do some more reading, this is where I'd start. But I'm just going to quickly now summarize what these 4 stages are. So the first stage is called the unitary concept of number. And so the example here they've got is for the number 25. When students stuck in the unitary concept thinking of the number 25, they're purely trying to hold 25 individual objects in their mind. So every new number is basically just a new name for it to represent an ever-increasing quantity. So think of it as like an infinite number line where every new number that comes across is a new number name that they've got to learn and memorize. So when you think of, a large number, even like 78, it becomes exhausting to think about because you're having to think about remember the sequence of number names all the way up to that point. Now, the second stage is called the 10 structured unitary concept. And so this is where after a bit of practice, bit of exposure to 2-digit numbers, they start to realize that they can group tens and then say, and that those grouped tens can have a new name. For example, 10, 20, 30. And so here, they end up getting stuck thinking of numbers like 25 as 10, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. Now, it's this stage where I find lots of students get stuck and never quite progress to the multi-unit concept. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So if a way to check to see if a student's stuck in the 10 structured concept is if you give them, say, a collection to count, maybe it's got 56. If to count that, they're having to count the decades, so go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then count on the remaining ones, then we know that they're stuck in this 10 structured way of thinking. But the third stage, which is often that transitional stage, is then when we've got the multi-unit. So now, instead of holding 25 things in their head and perhaps structuring them in decades, now they're just aware that, well, I've just got 2 tens and 5 more. So you can see just that different way of thinking reduces that cognitive load. It simplifies what they're imagining in their head. And so when they're at this stage, then if I said, well, you've got 25, 10 more, they can just think, well, I've got 2 tens and then 1 more is 3 tens, I'll have 35. So this is basically the foundation of the composite unit, where you can now, instead of thinking of 10, I can have 1 10 or 2 tens, which is just such an important point to get to. Then you can see the fourth and final stage is just an extension of that, when they now realize not only can I have my own unit for the tens, so I can think of 3 tens or 4 tens, but now I can have an additional unit that's now hundreds, or even a new unit for thousands, and so on. So the way you can check to see that students are in the multi-unit stage would be, if we give them that example before of 56, if I laid let's say 5 bundles of bundling sticks out, and then 6 more, they would just be able to look at it and go, well, I've got 5 tens, 6 more, 56. They wouldn't be stuck having to count by the decades. So now that we've had a really close look at place value and also considered these 4 different developmental stages of thinking when it comes to place value, I'm going to spend the rest of this video showing you some examples and activities you can do in your classroom to explore these concepts and make sure we're giving students experiences they need to make sure they have these understandings, to make sure they're developing trust in the count despite what year they're in, and to make sure that if they are stuck in, let's say, the 10 structured concept of place value, we can give them experiences to take that next step and develop that deeper understanding that they need to be successful in mathematics. Now, one of the first tools that we can use to help students progress through these different stages of place value understanding is a bead string. Now, you might notice that I've got a very specific structure to the way I've set up my bead string. You can see that I've got 2 alternating colours to 50, and then a further 2 alternating colours for another 50 to get to 100. Now, I might be breaking a rule here according to a lot of people, where, you know, a lot of people say that your bead string should always go to 120 because that's the point where students really struggle working out, you know, what comes after 100. They quite often get to 110 and then we'll start saying 200, 300, 400. But I've made the decision, and a conscious one, to only go to 100 because thinking about that idea of the composite unit. So I've got my individual count of 1s, then I've got structure for 10s, and then altogether my entire bead string acts as a new unit for 100. So that's why I've got multiple of these bead strings, because if I wanted to represent 104, then I could say, well, I've got 1 whole 100, and then on a separate bead string I would say, and 4 more. And that's one of the reasons I've made that decision. Also, because I've just got those 2 different alternating colours to 50, I can pick any point on my bead string. So let's just say I go something like this, and I can recognise what the collection is in either only 2 or 3 steps. So because I can pick that 50 mark straight away, I can just see that that's 54 without even just by looking. Now, when I ask my students this, I can straight away tell what phase of thinking they are in terms of their place value concepts. So if I've got a student that has to count this by going, well, I've got 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then maybe they can subitize the 4 at the end of 54, then I could say, ask the question, clearly they've shown me they're in the 10 structured concept, but then I could ask the question, how could we do that in less steps? And then another student might say, oh, well, I can just see 5 10s, I know that's 50. So just that slight language change, now we're working in that multi-unit concept. And so here I can just go, well, I've got 5 10s, 50, 4 more. If I grab another example like this, you can see that in terms of our ability to subitize, remember we can only subitize up to 5 things before it has to be conceptual subitizing. So here I'm subitizing 150, maybe one more 10, and I know that's 60, and then my extra 3 on the end there to get 63. So really I'm subitizing 3 individual collections, and then I'm using my conceptual subitizing to pull that together to find out the total. So a super useful tool for identifying where students are at and then moving them forward to that multi-unit concept. Now this next one might seem super obvious, which is count collections. But one thing that I think sometimes teachers miss is they might, every time they get students to count a collection, perhaps they roll dice, and so they're never actually getting the experience of counting collections where there's more of one particular unit than 10. So for example, here I've got more than 10 tens and more than 10 ones. Now this is really important because when we want students to count these collections, the way they count them will reveal a lot about where they are in terms of their stage of developmental thinking. So what I'm looking for is that hopefully the students will just be able to go, well, I've got 4 tens there, another 4, 8 tens, 10 tens, that's 100. I've got 3 more 10s, so now I'm up to 130. And let's have a look here. Well, I've got another 4 and a 2, that makes 10. So now I've got 140. And lastly, let's see if I can structure these. I've got 3 2s, so that's 6. So I've got 146. That's what we want from our students, because that shows us that we've got that multi-unitary concept. I know I've got 100, 4 tens, and 6 more. But often when you actually give the students a collection like this, what they'll do is they'll see tens and they'll start just going 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. And so as they keep going, the chances that they're going to make a silly mistake are obviously much higher because they're having multiple steps and not really providing any structure that's going to help them keep track. And then they might even sometimes won't even group the ones into a 10 and will just keep counting on. So this is a really revealing activity again if you want to see where students are at in terms of those stages. Now this next one is, again, it's so simple, but I find it super effective. And so basically it's place value counting, where I'm going to ask my students to subitize whatever collection they can see on this map. And so even though it's counting, we're not going to follow our predictable pattern. So for example, what I do is I have some MAB blocks to the side, and whatever this total collection that's placed on my map, the students have to call out. So for example, I would place 1 and they would say 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, I'm still focusing on structure, but then instead of adding what would predictably be 1 more to make 5, I might chuck in a 10. So now it's 14, 24, 34, 24, 34, 44, 45, 55, 155, 145, 144, 143, 243, 233, 223, 213, 203. So you can see how it's actually quite cognitive demanding as I increase the collection, and we can end up with 1,000. So now we've got a 1,203. And so this is really good at students being able to name the number and say the number, especially when we've got some of our units in our place value system that are missing. So for example, I take that 100 away, we've got 1,003, 1,004, 1,014, 1,024, 1,124, 124. So it's super quick. Students are getting, in just a matter of minutes, multiple chances to subitize different collections right up to 1,000. And maybe your students aren't ready for that. Maybe in prep, It might be, you might just be a couple of weeks in and they're struggling with their teen numbers, where you can just keep workshopping those kind of sweet spots. So, if they're really struggling with maybe that 12, 13, you can go, well, we've got 15, 1, 10, 5, 15, 1, 10, 4, 14, 1, 10, 3, 13, 1, 10, 2, 12, 1, 10, 3, 13, and you can just keep that block going backwards and forwards and still until students kind of can see it, they can learn from their peers, and then you slowly build on it. And then you can make it as complex or as simple as you like. But definitely worth giving a go. So earlier we looked at how you could use subitizing to think about our basic addition strategies visually. Now let's try that and extend it to think about how we can use subitizing and visualization to work out perhaps two-digit addition problems. So I'm going to put this addition problem up on the board. Now this time I want you to try and solve the exact same thing again, but this time I'm going to support it with imagery. Now that you're looking at this, what do you notice? Now I'm sure this time it's really easy to see that, well, I'm just imagining that one little block at the top sticking back to make 100, and I can straight away see the answer to this problem is just going to be 124 just by looking at it. Now I'm curious, I wonder how many of your students would perhaps even think about this in their head and lay it out as an algorithm with the 99, 24, the double lines down the bottom, and try and go through all those steps, when if they could just imagine it and imagine what was happening, it would just make it so much easier. And so this is again another way we can build not just subitizing but visualization into everything we do to help support students to think visually, and so they can choose appropriate strategies for the appropriate context. So now that we've examined how subitizing can fit into place value, let's now push that idea a little bit further and think, how can we build subitizing into something like multiplicative thinking? So here I've got a collection using my all-time favorite resource, single coloured plain square tiles. I like the squares because the structure fits together so nicely, and it's just, you can really see those patterns, such as, if I've got a tens frame here and take one, you can just tell it's 9 straight away. So let's look at now, I've got the collection 32, how could we incorporate multiplicative thinking? Well, this is where you can go and use that idea of imagine, and this is where your gesturing comes in really important. So I can say, well, we've got 32 here. Imagine I had 2 times as many. Imagine I had doubled it. So think about your tens frames here. Imagine there was a whole nother row here, and imagine your 2 ones here. How many do you have altogether? And so straight away, I can imagine where those tens would go, and now I can see without a doubt that it's 64 just by thinking and visualizing those extra counters where they go. Or for example, you can start asking questions like, I have 32 tiles here. How many 5s are there in my number? And so this is where you can start getting students to attend to the structure, because they can straight away see that, well, in one 10 there's 2 5s. So if in every 10 there's 2 5s, well, straight away I know I'm going to have 6 5s in 30. And then I'll obviously in this case have 2 left over. Or you can ask, and then, once they get competent with that, you can start testing these things and looking for patterns. So, how many 4s do I have in my collection? Well, I might quickly start to realize that within 10 there's 2 4s with 2 left over. So, which means if I've got 2 10s, well, there's 4 4s with 4 remainder, so then they'll combine to make a 5th 4. So I can start to internalize and memorize these patterns. So now, instead of rote learning my number facts, I start to learn that, well, in 20 there's 5 4s because I've had those experiences making it and seeing that structure. And then here I obviously know, well, I've got in this third 10, I've got 2 more 4s, and I'm going to see those extra ones go over there. Now altogether I can see that 7 straight away, I've got 8 4s. Moving along, let's now talk about subitizing with decimal numbers. Now, this idea with these resources came from Siemens. So basically, what I've made here is my own decimal kit. Because when you think about it, how many years have students spent in the early years making models of 2-digit, 3-digit numbers using concrete materials, and then all of a sudden we get to the middle and upper years where decimals are introduced, and often we just go straight to the abstract where we're not providing them with resources. So this kit is to make sure we fix that and give students the resources they need to have good mental conceptual objects for our decimal numbers. So this is a 1 meter piece of polypipe, and so this is our unit for 1. And then, after buying multiple of these, I've cut them down into our tenths. So 10 of these make 1 of those. So we now have our unit for 1, our units for tenths. Then these nuts are exactly, so these are cut to 10 centimeters in terms of their height. Then these bolts here are exactly 1 centimeter thick. So then we've got our whole, our tenths, our hundredths, and then finally we've got our washers, which are 1 mil thick. So these are now our thousands. So now using these materials, we can represent any decimal number up to the thousands. I can see I've got 3 tenths, 2 hundredths, and 4 thousandths. So really, really useful, especially then when you're comparing decimal numbers, you can actually line them up. So, for example, I could compare 3 tenths, 2 hundredths, and 4 thousandths with maybe something like 17 thousandths, because 17 thousandths may sound bigger, but when you've got the resources to actually put them together, you soon get students to find that well, actually those are quite small. So once you provide students with enough experience making and structuring decimal numbers with these resources, then eventually they can look at a number like this, and when they're thinking about its quantity and its size, they can imagine the different units. So they can see, well, I've got no ones, but I've got 3 of my tenths, and in their mind they can picture their 3 tenths and just have that number sense of, well, roughly what size will that be? Then they can picture, oh well, I've got 4 of my nut heads here, and then 1 thousandths, which is picturing their one skinny little washer. And it really, really helps them, especially when ordering decimals, and especially when you're dealing with decimals where they might not all go to the thousandths place. So you've got to order some decimals where you might have some that go to the thousandths place, some to the tenths, some to the hundredths. But having these individual units to attach and be able to perceive those numbers mentally can help an awful lot. So definitely recommend getting some of these and putting it together. It's worth the effort. So my final example of an activity I'm going to share with you now is how we can even push the ideas of subitizing and trusting the count into something like algebra. Now, algebra is one of those things where as soon as, students start seeing letters pop up in their number sentences, they completely panic, they break down, and it can be just that one level of abstraction that's a breaking point for most kids where their understanding just breaks down. And we all find it a challenge to teach. So let's consider how even something like algebra, we can support that understanding by bringing in trusting the count and subitizing. So here on the slide above me, you can see it says, imagine I've got 3x, take 5, but instead of just, talking about, well, it's just 3 times this unknown number, we can say, imagine if x was 2 apples. So, and again, using our gesturing, we can look at those 2 apples and say, well, imagine x was 2 apples. We're going to have 3 groups of those. So we've got 1, 2, 3. Now, just by moving my hands like that, what are you now picturing? I know I'm picturing like the shape of a 6 on a 6-sided dice, but in terms of my apples. So now I can say, well, if x was 2 apples, imagine I've got 1, 2, 3 groups of those, and now imagine I subtract 5. How many are we left with? And I can just through using my visualizing, my subitizing, I can see that I've got 1 apple left. Then I can say, well, okay, now imagine x was 3 apples. So let's think about that. Well, we've got one group of 3, 2 groups of 3, 3 groups of 3. So now I'm picturing like an array with 3 groups of 3. Now imagine again, and I love that word imagine. Use it wherever you can. Imagine I subtract 5 from that 9. How many apples do I have left? I've got 4. And then you can continue with 4 apples. And then once they've done that visualization, that's when you can start going in and expanding it and saying, well, what if x was 100? But I can still, because I've got my composite unit, I can do the same thing with 100. Now I can imagine I've got maybe a giant crate with 100, perhaps looks like an MAB square. 100 square, I've got 1, 2, 300 apples, and I've got to take 5 away from those, so I'm going to have 295 apples. All right, well, we've finally made it. We've taken a journey through subitizing and trusting the count and talking about that place value and the developmental stages, and I hope I've covered a broad range of the curriculum where you can see how those ideas that start right from foundation you can keep coming back to them over and over again. And although I've given you just a few examples at some different curriculum content, it's by no means the limit. So if you've made it this far, first of all, thanks for listening, and I really hope you've gotten something you can take away and maybe something you can embed in your classroom tomorrow. And if you do, I'd really love to hear about it in the comments and just see what's worked for you, even perhaps what hasn't worked, because I think, again, one of the main messages out of this was that subitizing, trusting the count, thinking about mathematics visually, it's not just a curriculum point that you can spend 3 activities and go, yep, they've got it, and tick off. It is a way of thinking mathematically that we need to keep hitting these students, whether in the grade prep all the way up to year 12. There is plenty of opportunities to keep coming back to the visuals, keep coming back to the underlying structure, and hopefully it will help your students thrive. It'll help your students be able to make sense of the world, and will just improve your teaching as well. So thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. And if you would like more content like this, then please like, subscribe, so it gives me the motivation to keep building this channel. Thank you.